Hello, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well and having a good evening. We're going to be learning the third chapter of the laws of Shabbat tonight, where the Rambam is discussing a very fundamental idea in regards to the laws of Shabbat. We say that we're not allowed to work on Shabbat. So that is in regards to us, to our animals, to our family, so on and so forth. Now, what about a certain possession that I own? Is that allowed to work for me on Shabbat? Meaning, if I have a certain machine, let's say I have a washing machine, which I set before Shabbat, and it starts to work, and it will go on its own, I have done what I have to do, and now it's just going to go on its own, and it has started the cycle, and now it's going to go throughout Shabbat. So the Rambam tells us that we are allowed to do such a thing. In other words, we are supposed to rest on Shabbat. But something that is going to be doing is going to be doing the labor on its own accord without needing our involvement is not a problem. For instance, we're allowed to turn on an irrigation channel. Back in the day, they would literally open up like the actual channel that was going in between the field and was bringing water. Or your water sprinkler system, today in a more modern style, right before Shabbat begins, and then it will sprinkle and water your grass throughout Shabbat. And then the timer will just turn it off on its own. Or just have the timer turning it on and turning it off. If it does not need any involvement from us, it is totally fine. And same, if someone is dyeing wool or linen, so they put it into a big pot full of dye, and then it sits there for many, many hours. So they're allowed to put it in before Shabbat, and it's going to sit there throughout the whole weekend, and then after Shabbat it'll come out and it's going to be ready. That's totally fine. Or to turn on the light before Shabbat and have the light on for Shabbat. It's a very practical thing that we do every week. So that's all allowed. So too also in regards to food. If we have food that we put onto the fire before Shabbat, so then, even though it is continuing to sit on the fire and to cook throughout Shabbat, we are allowed to eat that food on Shabbat, take it off the fire and eat it. Now, when it comes to food, this is when it starts getting a little bit more complicated. Because we have a problem. The rabbis, the rabbinic court, they realized that if we're talking about food and people who have a pot on the fire, there is one issue which is a very big problem. Is that if the fire starts dying down a little bit, and now the coals that are the base of the heat are not going to be as hot, you might want to stir the coals on Shabbat to make sure that the fire will keep its heat and will keep the food hot. So because of this problem, which is the problem of the stirring of the coals, which is what we're going to be referring to as we continue in this chapter, because of this issue, they made certain restrictions when it comes to food. And this is as follows. So I'm sure you've all heard of the concept of cholent. Cholent is a food that has either been prepared to a certain extent, or it's basic. It's just basically cooked. But as long as it sits on the fire, it becomes better and juicier and more delicious. So in other words, we want it to sit on the fire, and not just to keep it warm. And it's not that the quality of the food is going down as Shabbat goes along, but rather the contrary, it is becoming better and better as time goes on. So we are appreciating the fact that the fire is on and it's giving it heat because it's it's enhancing the food. So when it comes to such a situation, to have a pot sitting on the flame for the night of, we put it on before Shabbat begins and have it go throughout the night, that the rabbis are worried that maybe we're going to stir the coals. Our cholent is sitting and it's the middle of Friday night and it's late at night, and now it's already sitting on the flame for a good 6-7 hours. and the coals are starting to die out. And maybe you'll come and stir the coals, and now you're actually enhancing the fire on Shabbat, which is something which we're not allowed to do. So the rabbis were very worried about this. So therefore they said, what you are allowed to do in regards to a stovetop is that if you cover the actual source of the fire and you put the stove on top of it, so then that will be okay. Because you're not going to, the fire will not be revealed. The coals are not going to be revealed, that you're going to be seeing them and enhancing it and stirring them. So, therefore, today, practically, when we are putting our cholent on the fire, we put, and this is something which we practically do, we put a sheet of metal between the stovetop and the pot as a separation which covers the fire. So you don't actually see the stovetop. Even though, technically speaking, there are no coals, so there is nothing to be worried about. But maybe you want to turn the heat a little bit higher. Maybe you see that the water level is going down and you want to turn it a little bit lower. These are all practical problems which we deal with. Sometimes our cholent does burn because of it, but it's Shabbat and we're not allowed to play with the fire, with the heat. So therefore, we cover the stovetop and we put the pot on top of this sheet of metal, which is going to be in between the stove and the pot. All of this is because we are worried about that we're going to come and mix with the fire. That is all in regards to a stovetop. If we're talking about an oven, though, then that is something which we're not allowed to do. So in regards to an oven, even though we set it up all right before Shabbat and everything is ready to go, if the food is not ready yet, or if the food is being enhanced by the fact that it's in this hot oven, since the oven works in a different way and it's much hotter, and you can't really cover all the coals, so to speak. You can't really cover the source of the heat from where the food is sitting on. So therefore, you are not allowed to put food that it needs to be cooked into the oven before Shabbat and let it cook. But what you are allowed to do is that if you have food which is ready to eat, and you just want to keep it warm, it's not that it's enhancing the food, it's just keeping the food warm and ready to go. So then, if you are able, if the, I'm sorry, I'm just seeing what the Rambam writes over here. So since, if you are able to put it in a way that you won't, there's no reason to think that you will play with the fire, so then if the food is ready, so then we would be able to do this. We'll be able to put it into the oven. So there's actually ovens today, which is a very interesting thing. You can buy an oven today that has what is called Shabbos mode, which is a very interesting thing. We have an oven over here at Chabad Center. It's a regular oven from Whirlpool, and it has Shabbos mode on it. You look into the specs of the oven, you'll see if it has Sabbath mode. And what it does is basically it sets the oven to a preset heat. And throughout Shabbat, even if you press any buttons, by mistake, hopefully, even if you press any buttons to up the heat or lower the heat, it's not going to do anything. The oven is now set to a certain heat and it's not going to change. Even, and this is the most important part, if you open up the door of the oven, it's not going to change the heat of the oven, because the problem is if you open up an oven, now it's going to reheat it. So, it's not changing based on you're opening the door and closing the door. It's just set to that heat, and it's just giving out that heat in order to keep your food warm. It's almost like a food warmer, which just has one preset heat, and it just gives that heat. So that's something which you're able to do on Shabbat. And so since the food is ready, we're not worried that we're going to go and play with the coals and to make sure, because we just want it to be warm. We don't need it to be the cholent bubbling on the fire and having that good heat in order that it should be enhanced. Because if we are putting food that does need to be enhanced in the oven, so then that's something which we're not allowed to do. So in a case where a person, based on these rules, whenever a person has put food straight onto a fire, or someone has put raw food into an oven, or even partially cooked food into an oven at the beginning of Shabbat, and now it's cooking on Shabbat, the Rambam says we're not allowed to eat this food on Shabbat, because the rabbis were worried. They were concerned that maybe a person will say, "Oh, I didn't realize," so on and so forth. So since in such a case, the rabbi said you are not allowed to do this, they also part of that restriction they made that they said, do not eat this food even if you did it, but rather wait till after Shabbat to eat it. So if you have a cholent and you put it on the pot and you put it straight onto the stovetop before Shabbat, we are not allowed to eat our cholent. We have to wait till after Shabbat to eat it, sadly. So what's the way to do it? So there's two options. Either, as we said, to have a metal, just like a piece of metal, just a piece of metal, it's like a metal sheet, almost like a tray, which just sits on top of the stove, and then you put the pot onto that. Or they came up with an idea which is called a hot plate. A hot plate is again the same concept as we said in regards to the oven. You just plug it in, and it just has a preset heat, and it cannot change. There is no way of changing the heat, and you just put the pot on top of that heat. It's a low, just enough heat to keep it good and hot throughout Shabbat, and then you're good to go, because there is no way for you to change the heat on it. So that's the idea of the hot plate, the Shabbat hot plate. So let's say we do have a pot on our hot plate on Shabbat, or we have it on our sheath of metal, and it's sitting on our stovetop, and our cholent is cooking. And now it's Friday night, it's the middle of the night, and you're hungry. Or maybe it's Shabbat morning, before you go to service, and now you want to eat a good hot plate of cholent. Now, we take it off the fire. Now, are we allowed to put it back onto the fire? So, first of all, we're not allowed to open up the pot while it's on the fire, because the temperature is cooling down while it's on the fire, and then you're recovering it. But what if I do want to take some of the food? So there is one loophole, so to speak. There is one way of doing this, which the Rambam says is that if you take it off the fire and you hold it the entire time, you don't let it go, and you are taking food out of the pot, taking some cholent, you fill yourself up a bowl, and now you put back the cover, and then you are able to put it back onto the fire. Because as long as you haven't forgotten about it, and as long as you haven't put it down, so you are allowed to put it back. But on the other hand, you're not allowed to, and this is an interesting detail, if you have a food which is uncovered on the fire, you're not allowed to cover it while it's on the fire. So, in such a case, if this food was originally covered, this pot of cholent, you take it off, you take some food, you put back the cover, and then you can put it back onto the fire. Because as we said, if you have a pot which is or any food that is uncovered, you're not allowed to put like a blanket or some sort of material that will keep that heat there, because again, we don't want to be cooking on Shabbat. These are very interesting laws, and they're actually quite practical, although they are slightly complicated. So I hope I'm explaining this. I'm trying to explain this the best that I can. Although there are many details over here, and there are different things that, we get into complications sometimes when we get into all these details. So just bear with it, and slowly we'll try to go through all these various laws. What about if you have a pot on the fire? You're a child. You are also, as we said, you're not allowed to take food from, even if the pot is open, even if there's no cover on it. You're still not allowed to stick a ladle if you have, let's say, your chicken soup. It's sitting on the fire. You're not allowed to stick a ladle into it while it's on the fire, because sticking a ladle into food, you are essentially going to be stirring the soup when you take it out. And you're not allowed to stir the food while it's on the fire, because that's one of the actions of cooking. So therefore, you have to take it off the fire, take the soup that you want, or your chalent, and then put it back. What about putting in foods? I'm sorry, one second. So, let's say a person wants to put in some bread into the oven before Shabbat. What is the level that the bread has to be ready before Shabbat in order to make it permissible to put it in, even though it might continue on Shabbat a little bit? In other words, at what level is the bread called ready? So the Rambam says that the bread to be considered as being ready is in a case where it already has a certain crust on it. So if the bread already has a certain crust, so then you are fine. And in regards to other foods, so it depends. If we're talking about meat, so it takes longer to cook. So we have to make sure that it's totally cooked and totally complete before Shabbat begins, and it's just keeping the heat while Shabbat begins when it's inside the oven. The stovetop, as we said, is slightly different. So the bottom line is like this, out of this entire discussion. Whenever we talk about something that is doing work for us on Shabbat, so if we're talking about our water sprinklers, or we're talking about our washing machine, or something, or our big pot of dye with the material that is being dyed, in any of these cases, we're not worried that we're going to come and play with it, because it's not our food. When it comes to our food, we like it to be very specific. And therefore, because of this practicality, because of it, it's something which is in front of us, we go into the kitchen, we see what's going on, it's something which we have this issue that we might come and stir the fire. So that's why there was a special rabbinic restriction that was put into place. But anything which would not have this problem is fine. And therefore, when it comes to this, we have to be very careful in regards to how our food is made for Shabbat. So, on this same note, when we are talking about having, if let's say back in the day, or even today, if a person is lighting a fire in their home, in a fireplace, they heat up the house. It's in the middle of the winter, and you want the fire to be heated. Because of the same issue that we might stir these coals, the rabbi said that we need to make sure that the fire should be lit and totally engulfed in flames before Shabbat begins, because for the same reason, we're scared that the fire might not catch properly, and then we will come and we will stir it, and we're lighting the fire on Shabbat. So therefore, the rabbi said that we should make sure that the entire, the wood it's really burning well before Shabbat begins, and then we're allowed to enjoy that heat on Shabbat. If we're talking about a candle, we should make sure that the candle is actually lit properly and it's burning on its own before Shabbat begins. Or if we're talking about a fire that is made of reeds or seeds, something which is very easy to catch fire, so then you just have to light the beginning before Shabbat, and it's just going to go on its own, because it's obviously it's very easy to be kindled. And therefore, the same idea applies in this case. When there is a worry that we might stir the coals, there is a prohibition. There is the rabbis have put this special restriction in place. But if not, so then there is no problem to have your water sprinklers on its auto system to turn on and off on Shabbat, or your washing machine, or anything else of that style. So with that, we complete the third chapter of the laws of Shabbat. It's a little bit complicated, as I've warned, but we will go through it, and we will complete, God willing, the laws of Shabbat, all the 30 chapters of them, over the next couple of weeks. We will see you all tomorrow.